minus 18 degrees. The prairie wind didn't howl. It hissed through the seams of the sod cabin. Inside the cast iron stove, the last bed of coals was fading into an ashen gray.
Kellen? Are we out of wood?
We have enough. Hush now. Save your breath.
But he didn't reach for the sappy, green cottonwood logs in the corner. Instead, he pulled several bizarre chunks from a burlap sack, porous, flat, and bleached white, like sun-baked bones. Flint, the prairie dog, lifted his head, then quietly backed away into the shadows. Marion squinted through the dim light.
What is that? It doesn't look like wood.
Something our neighbors would rather freeze to death than touch. But tonight, it's the only thing keeping us alive.
No crackle, no sudden burst of flame. But then, a faint orange glow crept across the brittle edges. A stubborn, steady heat began pushing back the freezing air. Outside, the other cabins had already surrendered to the dark. But in here, that strange fire refused to die. The night that threatened to end everything had begun weeks earlier, before the cold settled across the prairie for good. Kellen and Marion Voss reached Red Antelope Flats in the last days of November 1876. Later than they had planned, and far later than the season allowed. Their small sod cabin stood with a roof thick enough to break the wind, yet narrow seams still showed along the north wall where daylight slipped through. Behind the cabin lay less than 2/3 of a cord of freshly cut cottonwood, heavy with moisture and far from ready for winter. No timber stood within easy reach. Every dry log had to be hauled from distant creek bottoms, and the cost had already climbed beyond what they could spare. Flint wandered slowly around the cabin, pausing wherever cold air leaked through the walls. Winter paid little attention to unfinished plans. It measured only what a family had ready before the first long freeze arrived. Asa Whitlock, an old homesteader who had buried enough neighbors to respect every prairie winter, stopped by the cabin before the first hard freeze. He studied the woodpile without touching it. The count was easy enough from where he stood. "A place like this needs at least 2 3/4 cords," he said at last. 3 1/4 if January decides to stay. His eyes settled on the green cottonwood stacked behind the cabin. That wood has work to do before it warms anybody. First it dries itself. Only then does it heat a room. Marion listened from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, saying nothing. The silence lasted longer than the conversation itself, because the numbers required no argument. They carried their own weight. Asa offered no criticism and no false comfort before leaving. Experience had taught him that winter cared very little about optimism. It always counted fuel before it counted hope. The next morning carried Kellen to the freight yard where Orrin Pike, the only man hauling seasoned cottonwood into Red Antelope Flats, was unloading another wagon. Orrin named his price without hesitation. It was high enough to empty what little money remained after the cabin had been built. Kellen said nothing. There was little reason to bargain when both men already knew the answer. Orrin glanced toward the small woodpile behind the cabin, where Flint circled once before, sniffing the damp cottonwood logs. "That stack won't last a week," Orrin said, a faint smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. "Around here, a man learns pretty fast that pride doesn't keep a stove burning." The wagon rolled away with its load still tied down. Kellen watched it disappear across the prairie until the sound of the wheels faded into the wind. Buying enough dry wood had never really been an option. Winter had simply waited for him to discover that fact on his own. The following afternoon, Kellen took Flint beyond the last homestead and headed west across the open prairie. Nearly 3 miles from the cabin, the land began to change. Thick grass gave way to broad patches of flattened earth, where enormous buffalo herds had once gathered before moving farther south. Their thunder had vanished years earlier. Only weathered bones, scattered hoof prints, hardened into the ground. and hundreds of pale gray buffalo chips remained under the winter sky. Flint slowed his pace. His nose stayed close to the frozen earth, weaving from one dried patty to another. He ignored the darker pieces and paused beside those bleached almost white by months of sun and wind. Watching the dog stirred a memory Kellen had not visited in years. Long before claiming land at Red Antelope Flats, he had worked beside freight wagons running the Platte River Trail. One bitter evening, with no trees for miles, an old wagon driver named Moses Greer had climbed down from his seat, gathered a few dry buffalo chips, and built a cooking fire before anyone else had finished searching for wood. Several young teamsters laughed until the coffee pot began to steam. Moses never argued with them. He simply nudged another weathered chip onto the coals and said, "Out here, a man doesn't burn what he likes. He burns what the land leaves him." At the time, Kellen had treated the lesson as another trail trick, useful for boiling coffee or heating a pot of beans before sunrise. A cabin through an entire prairie winter was something altogether different. Even so, that forgotten evening gave him a reason to kneel in the frozen grass. Instead of stepping over the weathered buffalo chips as everyone else did, he picked one up, turned it over in his hands, and wondered whether the prairie had been leaving behind more than most people ever noticed. Kellen carried a small stack of dry buffalo chips toward the settlement instead of heading straight home. Before reaching his cabin, he stopped at the edge of the flats where Ruth Bellamy, a widowed frontier traveler who had spent years crossing the plains with wagon trains, was splitting kindling outside her lean-to. She looked at the stack in his hands and nodded once. "So you remembered." Kellen mentioned the lesson Moses Greer had given him years earlier. Ruth smiled faintly. She had known men like Moses, practical people who learned from the prairie because they had no other teacher. "They burn for a reason," she said, picking up one of the weathered chips. "Buffalo lived on prairie grass. Even after it passed through the animal, those plant fibers never disappeared. Sun and wind finished the rest. Dry enough, those fibers will catch and hold a fire." She snapped the chip cleanly in half. "The outside can fool you. The center was pale from edge to edge. If the middle stays damp, the fire wastes its strength driving water out before it makes heat. That's when the smoke comes." She handed the broken piece back. Out on the trail, smoke drifted away. Inside a cabin, it stays with you. Her expression turned serious as Marion came to mind. A coffee pot over an open fire isn't the same as keeping a woman with weak lungs alive through January. Smoke will take her long before the cold does. Kellen looked down at the broken chip in his hand. Moses had shown him that buffalo chips could burn. Ruth had just explained the harder part. Burning them was only the beginning. Keeping a cabin warm without filling it with smoke would require something far more disciplined than a campfire on the open prairie. The first trial began before sunrise the next day. Kellen arranged several buffalo chips inside the cast-iron stove exactly as he had seen Moses do years before. Ruth's warning stayed in his mind, yet he trusted the dry, brittle edges more than he should have. For a few seconds, the fire looked promising. Then everything changed. Instead of burning cleanly, a thick ribbon of black smoke rolled upward before spilling back into the room. A sharp, bitter smell followed. Hidden moisture deep inside several chips was turning into steam, stealing heat before the fuel itself could burn. Flint stood at once, the dog backed toward the door, ears lowered, unwilling to stay near the stove. Across the cabin, Marion coughed into her blanket. The sound was quiet, but it cut deeper than any criticism could have. Kellen crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled the door open. Freezing prairie air rushed inside, carrying the smoke away while stripping the little warmth they had managed to build. He used the fire poker to drag a half-burned chip onto the hearth and broke it apart. The outside had become white and fragile. The center was still dark. Ruth had been right. The fire had spent its strength fighting hidden moisture instead of warming the cabin. No explanation was needed. The mistake lay in his hand, and Marion had already paid the first price for it. The failed fire changed the work, but it did not end it. Every buffalo chip Kellen gathered afterward had to earn its place before reaching the stove. He snapped each one in half, listening carefully as the pieces broke apart. The driest chips cracked with a sharp, hollow sound and felt surprisingly light in his hands. Others bent slightly before giving way. Their centers stayed dark, heavier than they looked, carrying a damp, earthy smell that no winter wind had fully taken away. Soon, he stopped judging them by appearance alone. The pale, weathered pieces became sun-gray. Those went into one pile. Anything with a brown core went into another and never reached the cabin fire. Marian watched the growing stacks without offering advice. Instead, she found scraps of canvas and quietly stitched them into storage sacks. One held fuel ready for the stove. The other waited for chips that still needed more time. Outside, Kellen built a simple drying rack beneath the roof overhang, raising it 22 inches above the frozen ground. Air could pass freely underneath while drifting snow stayed below the fuel. The prairie wind had caused part of the problem, yet he began using that same wind to finish the drying instead of fighting it. Flint seemed to make his own choice. He curled beside the sacks filled with sun-gray chips and ignored the others. Little by little, buffalo chips stopped looking like scattered waste left behind on the prairie. They became material that demanded patience, careful sorting, and steady discipline before they could ever be trusted with a family's winter. The careful sorting paid off sooner than Kellen expected. The next batch of buffalo chips was dry from edge to center, and this time he opened the stove draft much wider. Fresh air rushed beneath the fuel. The chips caught quickly, their pale surfaces glowing bright instead of filling the cabin with smoke. For several minutes, the little cabin felt almost comfortable. Marian lowered her blanket for the first time in days. Flint stretched beside the stove, enjoying the sudden warmth. Then the fire raced ahead of itself. Buffalo chips were filled with tiny spaces left by dried prairie grasses. With the draft opened too far, oxygen flowed through those natural air pockets and fed nearly every surface at once. Instead of burning slowly from the edges inward, the entire fuel bed began disappearing together. The heat climbed fast. It vanished just as quickly. By late afternoon, the stove was asking for more fuel again. Kellen counted what had already been burned and worked the numbers through his head. At that pace, the cabin would consume nearly 100 buffalo chips every day. The prairie held plenty of old buffalo trails, but not enough to waste fuel that carelessly through an entire winter. The lesson was impossible to ignore. A hotter fire did not necessarily mean a warmer season. It only meant the supply disappeared sooner, while the cold patiently waited for the next load of fuel. The disappointing numbers sent Kellen back to the stove, instead of back to the prairie. The fuel itself was no longer the biggest problem. Its behavior was. He sifted cold ashes from previous fires, mixed them with dry alkali clay and a handful of brittle prairie grass, then spread the mixture across the bottom of the firebox. Before lighting another batch, he narrowed the air opening beneath the grate. What had been a gap about 2 fingers wide became no wider than his thumb. The difference appeared slowly. Fresh buffalo chips no longer flared across their entire surface. The layer of ash softened the fire, while the smaller draft admitted only enough air to keep the coals alive. Instead of racing through the fuel, the burn crept inward from the edges. A steady bed of glowing embers remained beneath each new layer. Marian paid attention before Kellen spoke. The cabin carried far less smoke, and every breath came easier than the day before. Flint left the doorway and settled beside the stove again, resting without lifting his head every few minutes. That evening, Kellen counted the fuel once more. The stove now consumed between 52 and 60 buffalo chips a day, nearly half the previous rate. For the first time, the figures gave him something winter had not offered since they arrived. Not certainty. A realistic chance. By the end of the week, word had spread across the little settlement faster than the wind itself. People no longer asked how much wood Kellen had left. Instead, They asked why the smoke drifting from his chimney every morning was so thin and pale. However, that curiosity quickly turned to mockery once they found out what he was actually burning. Near the small church station, Orrin Pike let out a dry laugh when someone mentioned it. "So he's heating a house with dung now?" A few others chuckled with him. One man muttered that desperation could make a person believe almost anything if winter stayed long enough. Asa Whitlock remained quiet until the laughter faded. "A stove lasting one night isn't the same as a family lasting one season," he said. January has buried better ideas than that. The words carried no mockery, only experience. Deacon Harrow, who kept the settlement's tiny church and helped organize relief wagons whenever they reached the prairie, offered another path. "If the roads stay open another week, I'll send your name with the coal request," he told Kellen. "It won't be much, but it may carry you through the worst of it." Kellen thanked him. He never mentioned the drying rack behind his cabin. He never explained the ash bed or the narrowed draft. The prairie had not finished judging his idea, and until it did, there was nothing worth defending with words. The routine settled into every morning before daylight reached the prairie. Kellen left the cabin with Flint while the wind was still light enough to walk against. Together they covered the same 2 8/10 miles to the old buffalo grounds, returning with sacks that grew heavier each day. Flint wandered ahead, nosing through the frost until he found the pale, weathered chips. Kellen ignored anything with a dark center, no matter how dry the surface appeared. Back at the cabin, Marion had already prepared the storage sacks. One was marked for fuel, ready to burn. Another held chips that needed more days beneath the roof overhang. Nothing rested directly on the frozen ground. Every layer sat loosely stacked so air could pass between them, while drifting snow slid underneath without reaching the fuel. The rows lengthened a little each afternoon. Kellen never kept a written tally. He counted by neat stacks instead, knowing exactly how many chips each row contained. By the time December settled over Red Antelope Flats, nearly 2,100 buffalo chips filled the drying racks and storage sacks. Beside them sat a modest pile of cottonwood, reserved only for starting a bed of coals before the prairie fuel took over. Snow clouds gathered farther north. The old buffalo trails would soon disappear beneath them. Every trip made before that happened quietly stretched the family's chances of reaching spring. No single journey changed their future. Hundreds of ordinary trips, repeated with care, slowly did. Late December delivered the first real verdict. The temperature slipped to 9 degrees above zero, then dropped below it 2 nights later. Frost spread across the inside corners of the cabin walls before dawn, and the prairie wind returned with the steady patience that always came before a harder freeze. By then, Kellen had stopped saving the buffalo chips for experiments. They had become the family's primary fuel. The stove never roared. Its warmth rose slowly, settled into the room, and stayed there longer than it had before. The cabin still felt cooler than one heated by seasoned hardwood. Yet the cold no longer rushed back the moment the flames grew smaller. Marion noticed it first. She pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders and watched the stove for a long moment. "It isn't much warmer," she said quietly. "But the cold doesn't bite the way it used to." That single sentence mattered more than any number Kellen had written in his head. Flint offered his own answer without knowing it. Instead of pacing between the stove and the door, he curled beside the hearth after supper and slept there until morning without moving away from the heat. A day later, Ruth Bellamy stopped by the cabin. She rested one hand against the warm side of the cast-iron stove, then crouched beside Marion's sleeping alcove and pressed her palm against the packed earthen floor nearby. She stayed there for several seconds before standing again. A thoughtful smile crossed her face. "You're not making a bigger fire," she said. "You're making a slower winter." For the first time, someone besides Kellen could see that the prairie fuel was doing more than burning. It was holding the line between the family and the cold, one quiet hour at a time. Ruth's visit stayed with Kellen long after she had gone. Her words kept circling in his mind, but another detail mattered even more. The river stones resting beside the stove were still warm hours after the flames had settled into glowing coals. The fuel was only telling part of the story. Early the next morning, Kellen gathered smooth stones from a frozen creek bed, along with several sun-dried clay bricks left over from the cabin foundation. One by one, he arranged them around Marion's shallow sleeping alcove, leaving enough space for air to move while keeping the warm surfaces close to where she rested. The buffalo chips continued to burn the same way they had the day before. Their fire stayed low and steady. This time, however, the heat no longer disappeared into the room as quickly. The stones absorbed it through the afternoon and quietly released it after the flames had faded. He didn't stop there. Knowing the stones needed help to fight the drafts, Kellen gathered dried prairie moss and carefully stuffed it into the narrow seams along the north wall, sealing the very cracks where daylight used to slip through. Near the floor beside Marion's bed, the air held close to 54 degrees even while the temperature outside slipped below zero. Ruth returned 2 days later and crouched beside the alcove again. Instead of touching the stove first, she placed her hand against one of the river stones. It was still warm. She nodded without surprise. The fire isn't working alone anymore. Kellen had not found more fuel. He had found a way to keep each piece of fuel working longer. That evening, Flint curled into the narrow space between the warm stones and the foot of Marion's bed. Nothing in the cabin announced success. Yet the cold took longer to reach her than it had the week before. And that quiet difference was worth more than a brighter flame. January arrived with a different kind of danger. The temperature barely changed, yet the prairie wind did. Instead of sweeping across the open ground in broad gusts, it began striking the cabin from a lower angle, slipping beneath the roofline before curling around the chimney. Nothing looked unusual outside, but the stove answered first. Smoke hesitated. Then it rolled back into the room. Flint sprang to his feet with a sharp bark and retreated several steps from the hearth. Marion covered her mouth as a dry cough broke the silence. Within seconds, the clean-burning system that had worked so well the week before became almost impossible to breathe around. Kellen dropped to one knee beside the stove, instead of feeding it more fuel. The burn bed was still working exactly as it should. The problem wasn't inside the firebox. It was above it. Outside, he watched the smoke flatten against the wind before being forced downward. The chimney had lost its draft because the air no longer approached from the same direction. Nature had introduced a new variable without changing the fuel at all. He searched the shed and found an old sheet of tin, roughly 11 by 14 inches, left over from a broken wagon box. After cutting and bending it into a simple wind baffle, he fastened it to the windward side of the chimney and narrowed the stove's air opening slightly once more. The next stream of smoke climbed straight into the winter sky. Relief came quietly, but so did another lesson. A good fuel alone could never guarantee survival. Every part of the system had to work together, and the prairie only needed one weak point to turn warmth into danger. The change in the chimney did not stay secret for long. People noticed that smoke still rose from Kellen's cabin every morning, even after the latest cold spell tightened its grip on the prairie. Before long, Caleb Rusk, a young homesteader living 2 cabins east of Kellen's place, decided there was no reason to ask questions when the answer seemed to be lying across the old buffalo grounds. He gathered armfuls of buffalo chips that afternoon. Unlike Kellen, he judged them by color alone. Many still held damp, dark centers hidden beneath their weathered surfaces. Without giving them time to dry, Caleb loaded them into his stove and nearly closed the draft, believing a slower flow of air would trap more heat inside the cabin. It did exactly the opposite. The weak fire struggled for air while the damp fuel released heavy steam. Thick smoke spilled from the stove joints and drifted across the single room. Tessa Rusk, Caleb's wife, pulled the front door open in panic. Their 2 young children stumbled into the freezing air, coughing so hard they could barely catch a full breath. The news reached Kellen before sunset. He looked toward the drying racks outside his cabin. The rows of carefully prepared fuel were shrinking faster every day under the endless cold. Marion followed his eyes without saying a word. She understood what he was measuring. Helping Caleb would cost more than buffalo chips. It would mean sharing the knowledge that had taken weeks of mistakes to earn, while giving away part of the fuel reserve that still stood between their own family and the rest of the winter. Kellen waited until dawn before making his decision. He counted out 140 sun-gray buffalo chips from his own supply, tying them into 2 canvas sacks. The number bothered him. Every piece carried away from his drying racks narrowed the margin that still protected Marion through the weeks ahead. Flint followed as he crossed the frozen prairie toward the Rusk cabin. Caleb met him outside, his face carrying enough embarrassment that no apology was necessary. Kellen set the sacks on the ground without mentioning them. Instead, he walked straight to the stove. The first armful of damp buffalo chips went back outside. Next came the draft. Kellen opened it until the fire could breathe again, then spread a thin layer of sifted ash across the firebox before adding only a few fully dried chips. He showed Caleb how to break each piece apart before trusting it. A clean, pale center. A sharp crack. A light weight in the hand. Those signs mattered far more than the color of the surface. When fresh smoke drifted upward, Kellen pointed toward the chimney instead of the flames. "Watch the smoke," he said quietly. "Then watch the coals." The smoke gradually thinned. The embers settled into a steady glow instead of a bright blaze. Outside, the 2 men built a simple drying rack from fence rails, lifting the remaining buffalo chips well above the frozen ground, where wind could finish what time had not. Back at their own cabin, Marion stood beside the storage sacks after Kellen left. One by one, she counted the shortened rows in silence before tying each canvas bag closed again. The stove inside the Rusk cabin was finally burning the right way. Whether the smaller fuel reserve at home would still carry her own family through the rest of winter remained a question only the Prairie could answer. Morning revealed the answer before anyone spoke. A thin ribbon of pale smoke rose from the Rusk cabin and climbed straight into the still January air. It was light enough to drift with the breeze instead of spilling back toward the roof. More importantly, it carried none of the thick black stain that had darkened the sky the day before. Inside, both children were awake. Their coughing had faded into little more than sore throats. Tessa opened the door with tired eyes, but she stood without panic this time. Warm air slipped past her shoulders instead of heavy smoke. Word spread quietly. Orrin Pike rode over to the Rusk cabin, expecting to witness another failed experiment. He slowed his horse beside the cabin and watched the chimney for several moments. The stove was burning low. The smoke stayed clean. Nothing matched the story he had been prepared to tell. He left without a joke. Ruth Bellamy arrived a short while later. She looked once at the chimney, then once through the open doorway where the stove glowed with a calm bed of coals. "They stopped trying to make it roar," she said. That was all. Asa Whitlock reached the Rusk cabin before noon. He studied the fire, the drying rack outside, and the orderly stacks of pale buffalo chips resting above the snow. His attention lingered longer than before, not because he had suddenly abandoned the old rules of the Prairie, but because he recognized another one taking shape beside them. Across the settlement, Kellen never stepped forward to explain what had happened. He stayed home repairing another storage sack while Flint slept near Marion's feet. The strongest argument no longer belonged to him. It rose quietly from the Rusk chimney, carrying proof that a family had survived the night. The change spread through Red Antelope Flats one careful lesson at a time. A few mornings after the Rusk family recovered, Asa Whitlock arrived at Kellen's cabin, carrying a canvas sack filled with buffalo chips. He poured several onto the ground without saying a word. "Show me which ones you'd keep." He broke one chip cleanly in half, handed another back to Asa, and let the old homesteader compare the pale center with a darker one that still held moisture. Before long, Asa was sorting them correctly on his own. The knowledge moved farther than the fuel ever could. Deacon Harrow opened the little church storage shed to families with the smallest wood piles. Instead of filling it with loose buffalo chips, they stacked carefully dried fuel inside, separated from pieces that still needed more time beneath the wind. The building became less a warehouse than a place where good habits were protected before the fuel ever reached a stove. At Kellen's cabin, Marion and Ruth quietly showed other women how to test each chip. They listened for the sharp crack, checked the color of the center, felt the weight in their hands, and learned that drying mattered as much as gathering. Outside, Kellen helped the men adjust stove drafts, spread thin ash beds across fireboxes, and place river stones where the warmth could linger long after the flames settled into coals. One afternoon, Flint wandered toward the old buffalo grounds and stopped beside a familiar wagon. Orrin Pike was there. He bent down, picked up a weathered buffalo chip, turned it over in his hands, and dropped it into his sack with the rest. No apology followed. None was expected. The laughter that had once followed Kellen's chimney gradually disappeared from the settlement. Work replaced it. People no longer believed they had been saved simply by burning buffalo chips. They understood that survival came from respecting the entire system, choosing the right fuel, drying it patiently, controlling the draft, protecting the coals with ash, and storing heat instead of wasting it. The Prairie had accepted those lessons long before anyone living there did. By the middle of February, the Prairie finally began to loosen its grip. The worst winds had passed. Bitter nights still returned from time to time, but they no longer lingered for weeks. Kellen noticed the change first in his daily count. During the hardest stretch of winter, the stove had consumed nearly 75 buffalo chips each day. Now the number settled between 48 and 55 without leaving the cabin cold. The system had found its rhythm. Marion spent longer hours on her feet, moving about the cabin without the coughing fits that had once followed every breath of smoky air. Flint no longer pressed himself against the stove through the night. More often, he slept beneath the edge of the bed, stretched out in quiet comfort, instead of curling tightly against the cold. Nothing changed about the way Kellen tended the fire. He still laid each buffalo chip onto the glowing coals one at a time. The ash bed remained in place. The draft stayed carefully adjusted. The river stones continued storing warmth after the flames settled. Habit had replaced experimentation because the Prairie had already delivered its verdict. Across Red Antelope Flats, conversations sounded different than they had in November. People stopped asking how many cords of wood a family had stacked before winter. Instead, they asked whether the buffalo chips were dry all the way through, whether the chimney was drawing cleanly, and whether the heat bank had been placed where it would do the most good. However, no one harbored the illusion that the Prairie would provide this fuel forever. The massive buffalo herds were gone for good, and those weathered chips would eventually run out. Because of this, as soon as the ground thawed, the men in the settlement began hauling green cottonwood, giving the fresh logs a long summer to dry out completely. Beneath the roof overhangs, a dual reserve took shape. Cords of dry, splitting wood stacked right alongside rows of pale buffalo chips. No matter what fuel they burned, the lesson of patience and controlling the fire remained the same. No one called Kellen a hero. He never expected them to. When spring finally began pushing winter back across the Prairie, the cabins still held living families, steady fires, and quiet breaths. Nature had never argued against his idea. It had simply tested every part of it. The families who reached the end of that season did so for one simple reason. They had learned that surviving winter was never about building the biggest fire. It was about making every degree of warmth stay just a little longer before the cold could claim it.